Imagine a trusted nurse, a guardian of the sick, silently transforming into a harbinger of death. Over 16 years, Charles Cullen, known as the Angel of Death, is suspected of claiming up to 400 lives within the very hospital sworn to heal. How did this healer become one of history's most prolific serial killers, leaving a trail of death without a trace? Welcome to Shocking True Crime Stories, where the most chilling, real-life crimes come to light. Every case we cover is based on true events, some terrifying, some unbelievable, but all shocking. If you have a passion for uncovering the darkest mysteries of the criminal world, you're in the right place. Subscribe now, and let's dive into the depths of true crime together. It was a typical day in 1988 at St. Barnabas Medical Center in Livingston, New Jersey. The halls of St. Barnabas Medical Center were alive with the usual rhythm of a busy hospital. Nurses moved swiftly between rooms, doctors discussed cases in hushed tones, and the steady beeping of monitors filled the air. Families sat anxiously by their loved ones' bedsides, hoping for signs of improvement, trusting the expertise of those in white coats and scrubs. It was just another day in 1988. Routine, predictable, but beneath the surface of that routine, something else was happening, something no one could quite explain. Patients who had been stable, even improving, suddenly took a turn for the worse. A man recovering from surgery was found unresponsive, his heart inexplicably failing. A woman scheduled for discharge never woke up. A few cases raised eyebrows, but each had a reasonable explanation. Complications, underlying conditions, the unfortunate but expected losses that come with any hospital. And yet, it kept happening. An elderly patient admitted for dehydration was gone by morning. A middle-aged father being treated for an infection suffered an unexpected cardiac arrest. Each case, when looked at individually, made sense, but when put together, the pattern was unsettling. Doctors puzzled over the numbers, unable to find a common link. Autopsies provided few answers. Families grieved, accepting the explanations given to them, never suspecting that their loved ones had been taken, not by illness, not by chance, but by something far more disturbing. Through it all, Charles Cullen walked the halls of St. Barnabas, quiet and unassuming. He tended to his patients like any other nurse. He checked charts, adjusted IVs, whispered reassurances in the dim glow of hospital rooms. No one looked at him twice. No one questioned his presence. And so, the deaths continued. No one knew it then, but this was only the beginning. The first chapter of a story that would stretch across 16 years, multiple hospitals, and an unimaginable number of victims. A story that would reveal how a single man, working in plain sight, could take hundreds of lives without ever raising suspicion. When Charles Cullen first stepped into the halls of St. Barnabas Medical Center, no one could have predicted the horrors that would follow. He was just another new nurse. Another set of hands to help in the constant, tireless work of patient care. His colleagues saw him as competent, quiet, perhaps a little withdrawn, but skilled in his duties. In a hospital setting, where stress ran high and shifts blurred together, his reserved nature hardly stood out. But beneath the surface, something else simmered. His first known victim was John Yengo, a respected judge who had checked into the hospital for what should have been a routine procedure. His condition was stable. There was no reason to suspect that his stay at St. Barnabas would be anything other than brief and uneventful. His family expected him to return home, to sit at his desk once more, to continue the life he had built. Instead, he died suddenly, without warning. There was no struggle, no dramatic moment. No one rushed into his room to find him gasping for breath. He simply slipped away, his body betraying him in ways that no one could explain. Doctors were puzzled. But in the absence of clear evidence, his death was attributed to natural causes. Another unfortunate case in a place where loss was a part of daily life. But it wasn't natural. Charles Cullen had been in the room. He had stood beside Yengo's bed, unnoticed, unseen, and with a quiet, practiced hand, he had injected a lethal dose of medication into his IV, ensuring that the judge would never leave that hospital. It was a decision made in an instant, a single deliberate act that ended a life. And once Cullen realised how easy it was, how effortless, there was no turning back. This was just the beginning. As the years passed, he moved from hospital to hospital, leaving a trail of unexplained deaths in his wake. At Warren Hospital in Phillipsburg, New Jersey, his methods became even bolder. He began using digoxin, a powerful heart medication. In the right dose, it could save lives. In the wrong hands, it was a silent executioner. His victims never saw it coming. They lay in their hospital beds, trusting, unaware that the very medication meant to help them was sealing their fate. Cullen worked in silence, his actions precise, calculated. He had no need for violence, no need for struggle, just a syringe, an IV line, and time. One elderly woman, barely strong enough to lift her head, noticed something others had missed. She reported seeing a male nurse in her room during the night, a shadow moving quietly beside her bed. She felt a prick, the sensation of an injection. Frightened, she told hospital staff what had happened. They dismissed her. A confused patient, they thought. A side effect of illness, of medication. Her words were brushed aside, and no one investigated further. No one questioned Cullen, and so he continued. His confidence grew, his kills became more frequent. He moved through the hospital undetected, his crimes hidden beneath paperwork, buried under assumptions. His victims died quietly, one after another, their deaths written off as tragic but explainable. No one was watching, no one was stopping him. By 2003, the walls of Somerset Medical Center in Somerville, New Jersey, held a growing number of unanswered questions. Patients who had been improving, some even days away from being discharged, began to slip away without warning. One moment, they were talking, laughing with their families, looking forward to going home. The next, they were gone. Doctors searched for explanations, but the deaths were baffling. Some patients suffered sudden cardiac arrests. Others had unexplained crashes in blood pressure. Their bodies gave out in ways that defied logic. There were no signs of infection, no clear medical errors. And yet, one after another, they died. Still, no one suspected murder. Hospitals are places where death is tragically a part of life. And in a fast-paced environment where hundreds of patients come and go, patterns can be difficult to see, especially when no one is looking for them. But something was happening behind the scenes at Somerset, something that no one could ignore forever. The hospital's computerized drug dispensing system had been quietly recording data. Every medication request, every dose administered, it was all logged, and as the deaths continued, strange anomalies began to appear. Medications were being withdrawn at odd hours, in doses that made no sense. Drugs that hadn't been prescribed to certain patients were showing up in the records. Some were removed from the system, but never officially given to a patient. Others were requested and then quickly cancelled, as if someone was trying to cover their tracks. It wasn't until a critical care nurse, Amy Lochran, took a closer look that the pieces started to fall into place. Amy had worked alongside Charles Cullen. She had chatted with him, shared shifts with him, trusted him. To her, he was just another nurse, maybe a bit distant, but far from suspicious. But when she examined the records, something about his activity didn't sit right. She noticed the cancelled orders, the drugs that had no business being administered in the amounts he was requesting. Her pulse quickened. The more she looked, the more uneasy she became. Could it be a mistake? A computer error? She wanted to believe that. But deep down, she knew. The evidence was there, buried in the data, hidden beneath layers of routine hospital work. The deaths weren't accidents. They weren't the natural course of disease. Someone was making them happen. And all signs pointed to Charles Cullen. Amy had a choice. She could ignore it, pretend she hadn't seen the pattern. Speaking up would mean putting herself in danger, going against someone she had worked beside for years. But if she stayed silent, more people would die. So she made the hardest decision of her life. She went to the authorities. Investigators listened as she laid out what she had found: the suspicious drug withdrawals, the unexplained deaths, the patients who had no reason to die, yet never made it out of the hospital. And then, the most dangerous step of all, Amy agreed to go undercover. She would wear a wire. She would sit across from Charles Cullen, the man she had once called a colleague. She would pretend nothing had changed, that she wasn't terrified, that she wasn't recording his every word. She would draw him out, gain his trust, and, if everything went as planned, get him to confess. But there was one problem. No one knew what Cullen would do if he realised the truth. Would he deny everything? Would he lash out? Would he kill again, this time to protect himself? Amy had stepped into a game of life and death. The only question was, who would make the final move? As investigators delved deeper into the case, the truth that emerged was more unsettling than anyone could have imagined. Charles Cullen had not just taken lives, he had done so with calculated precision, slipping through the cracks of a system that should have stopped him long ago. He had moved unseen, unrestricted from hospital to hospital, using his position as a nurse to carry out silent, undetectable murders. And the most disturbing part? The institutions meant to protect patients had unknowingly enabled him. The evidence painted a horrifying picture. Cullen had exploited his access to life-saving medications, turning them into instruments of death. Insulin, digoxin, epinephrine, drugs meant to stabilize and heal, became his weapons of choice. He administered them in doses too small to immediately raise suspicion, but potent enough to end a life. A slow poisoning, a sudden heart failure, a quiet death in the middle of the night. His victims were not chosen based on any pattern beyond opportunity. Some were elderly, their declining health making their death seem natural. Others were post-surgical patients, expected to recover, yet slipping away without reason. A young mother recovering from childbirth, a father regaining strength after an illness, a grandmother who had just been told she was well enough to go home. All had trusted him. All had been vulnerable. And all had died without knowing why. But Cullen had not acted in secrecy, not entirely. There had been signs, red flags that, in hindsight, seemed glaringly obvious. At nearly every hospital he worked in, whispers had followed him, unexplained deaths, odd medication errors, concerns from colleagues that were brushed aside. Some hospitals had quietly let him go, terminating his employment without reporting him to authorities. They had suspicions, yes, but pursuing them meant trouble. Lawsuits, bad press, questions they weren't prepared to answer, and so they chose silence. Each time Cullen was asked to leave, he simply moved on. Another hospital, another job, another set of patients who would unknowingly place their lives in his hands. The system's failure had given him freedom, a murderer allowed to walk the halls of medicine unchecked, disguised in scrubs, wielding a syringe instead of a knife. By the time anyone put the pieces together, it was too late. The death toll had climbed into the hundreds. Lives lost that should have been saved, families robbed of final goodbyes, and one man, moving through the corridors of hospitals without a single person realizing they had just crossed paths with a killer. On December 12, 2003, Charles Cullen's reign of quiet terror finally came to an end. For years, he had walked freely among the sick and the dying, blending into the sterile white walls of hospitals, a trusted figure in the very places meant to save lives. He had taken more victims than anyone could count, slipping through the system time and time again. But on that cold December day, the mask he had worn for 16 years was ripped away. Authorities moved in swiftly. There was no struggle, no dramatic chase, just a man who had evaded justice for far too long, now sitting in handcuffs, caught in the very world he had once controlled. The interview room was quiet, the air heavy with the weight of the truth that was about to unfold. And then he spoke. Cullen admitted to killing at least 40 patients. It was a staggering number, one that would make him one of the deadliest serial killers in history. But investigators knew better. The real count. It was almost impossible to determine. The records were incomplete. Many of his victims had been cremated. In some cases, their deaths had been written off as complications, lost in the endless sea of medical paperwork. Experts analysing his movements, his access to patients, and the unexplained deaths in the hospitals where he worked estimated that the number could be far higher. Some believed it reached 400 lives. It was a number so vast, so incomprehensible, that it placed him in the ranks of the most prolific murderers the world had ever seen. In 2006, the final judgment was delivered. There would be no chance for freedom, no possibility of walking out of a prison cell like he had walked out of so many hospitals before. Charles Cullen was sentenced to 18 consecutive life sentences. The weight of his crimes was so great that even the concept of parole was meaningless. He would not be eligible until the year 2403. By then, everyone he had ever known, every family he had shattered, would be long gone. But his legacy, the horrifying reality of what he had done, would remain. His case sent shockwaves through the medical community. Hospitals could no longer afford to look the other way, to pass troubled employees along without consequences. Reporting procedures changed, safeguards were put in place, and the world was forced to confront an unsettling truth. Even in places of healing, even among those sworn to protect, darkness could exist. Charles Cullen had been a nurse, a caregiver. And yet, in the quietest of ways, he had become something else entirely. An executioner in scrubs, hidden in plain sight. The story of Charles Cullen is a haunting reminder of the darkness that can lurk behind trusted facades. It underscores the necessity for vigilance, transparency, and accountability within healthcare systems. How many lives could have been saved if earlier suspicions had been acted upon? This case challenges us to reflect on the balance between trust and scrutiny in professions dedicated to preserving life. What are your thoughts on the systemic failures that allowed Charles Cullen's actions to go undetected for so long? Do you believe more stringent reporting laws could prevent such tragedies in the future? Share your opinions in the comments below. If this story intrigued you, don't forget to like, subscribe and click the notification bell for more deep dives into shocking true crime stories. And if you think this case was unsettling, stay tuned for our next episode. Thanks for watching.